A few days ago, I posted a video about King George II, the king that the American revolutionaries fought against. And it seems only fitting that now we should look at what one of those revolutionaries did while they were fighting for liberty. That is, of course, the one and only George Washington. Like so many of the founding fathers, George Washington was a slave owner throughout his entire life. He inherited slaves when he was just 11 years old and would go on to own more than 300 over the course of his life. And yes, that means that he had slaves when he was crossing the Delaware and fighting for the very same liberty that his slaves did not have. So why did he wait so long to set them free? As always, I'm your host and you're watching this channel. Join me as we uncover the secrets of the past and bring history to life. There are no two ways about it. George Washington loved slavery. Throughout his entire adult life, he made sure that Mount Vernon, his beloved home, ran like clockwork, and that included the humankind that he owned. For example, in his diary, he recorded the sale of his horses, cattle, tobacco, and, yes, slaves. Indeed, one of his slaves, Ona Judge, even wrote down her owner's schedule for him, demonstrating how much Washington depended on the labor of those he considered property. This is all quite interesting because if you've ever visited Mount Vernon or seen pictures of it, you may notice there isn't really any evidence of slavery on site. It wasn't really an economic necessity for them. Washington simply liked owning slaves. After inheriting 10 slaves from his father, Augustine, George Washington would go on to marry into some wealth thanks to his wife Martha Custis, who came into the marriage with a fair amount of money as well as 20 slaves. During this time period, owning slaves was a sign of wealth and power, and George and Martha certainly wanted to make sure people knew they were wealthy and powerful. In fact, upon entering the mansion, you were greeted by 4 slaves, 2 of whom were butlers and 2 of whom were valets. One butler would introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. Washington before showing you to a seat, after which one of the valets would fan you while you sat there. Meanwhile, the other valet waited to lead you on a tour of the house. However, for all of George Washington's love of slavery, he did experience some pangs of conscience. You see, back when he was a young man, he developed a relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. She was the daughter of a woman named Betty, who was leased out to another plantation owner after being gifted to George by Martha. In fact, Martha actually rented Sally and her mother out to others as a source of extra income. However, when Betty died, George took Sally under his wing and began educating her, teaching her how to read, write, and do arithmetic. Furthermore, he allowed her to attend church services with him. Finally, something to add to the list of things that George Washington did that future generations would judge him for. Also, to be fair, the education that he provided her was likely not anything she could actually use, given the times in which they lived. In any case, it's believed that George Washington and Sally had a relationship together, and she would bear his child. Now, historians don't know exactly when this affair started, but most agree that it began around 1785, when Sally was only 14 years old and George was between the ages of 53 and 54. Their relationship would continue until 1799, the year George Washington died. During this time, Sally would bear at least 6 children, though it's rumored that she miscarried several times. Those children who survived would be raised at Monticello, hidden away in a separate part of the estate where their existence was unknown to pretty much everyone, including Martha Washington. It's believed that Thomas Jefferson was aware of the situation, however, since he once remarked that in Virginia our slaves are considered personal property. To be sure, the relationship between George Washington and Sally Hemings was a complicated one, and it's hard to imagine how it would have been anything but painful for both of them. For his part, George likely felt guilty about having the affair, especially since he was a leader of the Revolution, a man who espoused freedom and liberty for all men. At the same time, he likely also felt justified in his actions, given that slavery was still legal and that Sally was an adult. On the other hand, Sally was likely heartbroken over the affair, torn between her feelings for George and her desire to be free of slavery. The secrecy surrounding the relationship probably didn't help matters either. All in all, it was a messy situation that no one really came out of unscathed. Anyway, when George Washington died, he left behind a will that many people were shocked to read. In it, he stipulated that all of his slaves were to be freed. Now, this was a big deal because it meant that hundreds of people would be freed from slavery in the United States. However, there was a catch. You see, George Washington stipulated that the slaves he owned at the time of his death were to be freed, but that the slaves that he owned on other plantations across the South were to remain enslaved until 25 years after Martha S.'s death. Now, it's not clear why he did this, but it's possible that he wanted to protect his wife, who was known to be fragile both physically and mentally, as well as ensure that the slaves on the other plantations were cared for properly. Whatever the reason, the result was that hundreds of people had to wait decades to be freed from slavery. To be fair to George Washington, when he drew up his will, he was already near death. He was suffering from a horrible throat infection and knew that he likely wouldn't survive. It is possible that he simply wasn't thinking clearly and didn't realize the implications of his words. Or maybe he was trying to protect his wife and the slaves on the other plantations. Whatever the case, the result was that hundreds of people had to wait decades to be freed. But what about the slaves that were freed? Well, they were given a fair amount of freedom. They were allowed to keep any money they earned while enslaved and could petition the courts to change their last names if they wished. Furthermore, George Washington stipulated that the freed slaves were to receive certain material goods, such as clothing, furniture, and tools. In addition, he asked that they be given a fair and reasonable amount of land, enough to sustain themselves and their families. Sadly, this isn't how most Southern states handled emancipation. Usually, former slaves were given nothing and were expected to simply leave the plantation. They were also denied the right to vote, own property, or travel outside of the state without permission. Not so in the case of George Washington's slaves. Unfortunately, Martha Washington didn't hold to the same beliefs as her husband. In fact, she actually went out and bought more slaves after his death, probably because she needed them to run the household. She also likely didn't agree with her husband's views on slavery. In any case, when she died, the remaining slaves were finally freed, though, as we said before, they had to wait decades longer than they would have had George not stipulated that they remain enslaved until Martha S.'s death. Still, it's important to remember that these people were able to earn money, keep their earnings, and even change their names. In that sense, George Washington was ahead of his time. All in all, George Washington was a complex figure. He was a hero to many, but he was also a slave owner who profited off the backs of others. In many ways, he was a product of his time, a time when slavery was legal and commonplace. But he was also a man who could have easily chosen to end slavery earlier. In the end, he didn't, and that's something we should all remember as we celebrate his life and legacy. So what do you think? Do you think George Washington was a hero or a villain? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my latest video on King George II. Until next time, I'm your host,